So I want to start by saying that a bunch of the stuff that we are talking about here today is fascinating to me. And I thought I was a pension expert, but I don't know frick all about this stuff in the past. What I think is important is to try and talk about one of the other projects we're engaged in that I know other unions have done work on in the past and are still doing, is this economic literacy kind of work with our members about helping to see sort of the veil placed over our lives in this economy. But it is a fundamentally political question, and in my mind, a fundamentally political question means that it's really about our people. It's about our members, it's about, and our neighbors, and talking to them and figuring it out. I mean, we can talk about, you know, there's still red baiting that happens in unions, let's be honest. RSPs are, of course, an attack on pensions because they're an attack on all this stuff. Because they're about banks wanting the money and not anybody else. I mean, here's what's interesting. Some very thoughtfully prepared and eloquently put criticisms of pensions as, in some ways, if I was hearing some of what you were saying, like the instrument of advancing capitalism in the first place. Like, but here's the thing. The big dogs on Bay Street think that Michael Nobrega at Omer's is like an idiot, right? They think he's nobody. They don't respect him, right? And he wants to be a big dog. Like, it's kind of bizarre, right? I mean, in this, there is another whole thing about this, and really it is about a chase for money and capital, which is really, you know, what capitalism is all about. And here's the truth, our members are stuck in the middle of it. So, like, what do we do then, right? I mean, so we can certainly talk about what we can do, but it has to be more than thinking about the past. It also has to be about thinking about the future, I think, right? And so for me, I'm like, you know, the stuff about the CPP has been fascinating for me too, because one of the things that I felt like I was hearing from some of our folks who are engaged in pension plans during the campaign to expand the CPP was that they were centered in their plans with this kind of like, well, that would be bad. Like, expanding the CPP would be bad. Because they saw their plans that they have now felt some ownership of as being in competition with the CPP, because there's only so much money, you know, and there's only so much money that workers have, there's only so much money that employers have, and if money's going to go over here, there's a CPP offset, and then CPP's got the money and not our plan, and our plan needs the money to invest in order to make the returns. Like, it is quite complicated, right? And I'm not 100% sure I understand how to unpack it all, except to just be open and honest and upfront with people about, you know, everyone deserving, appealing to the principles that people, I think, generally find difficult to refute, right? And so, we just had a discussion also, I was just involved in a discussion about investments, and I just am terrified of greenwashing. I'm terrified of these funds that sound like they're progressive when really, like, you just have to dig a layer into a layer into a layer before you find that you're actually investing in tobacco and in some coal-fired like, it's crazy, right? Like, it's, you have to dig a little, right? But it's scary beyond belief to me. Like, this is all dirty, right? Like, let's just be honest. Like, there is no clean capitalism. Like, it's all dirty. So the question becomes, like, are we dirty up to here where we can't breathe? Or are we dirty, like, down to our knees? Like where, it's a level of degree, right? Like, I don't know that there's clean. I really, I don't. I'm not saying that to be anything other than honest and cautious, I think. So it goes to the need to continue to do economic literacy, but also literacy around these issues. I would dare say that most of our members in our union, 70% of whom are lucky enough, well, I find somebody who didn't have a workplace pension, who was in fact afraid of dying in poverty. Like, I watched my father and heard about his father doing, because that's what the history of my family was. Nobody had workplace pensions, right? In fact, when my dad got CPP, he was actually doing remarkably better than he had at his last job. But anyway, we have to figure out a way to help our people to see some of these things and to do some education. And it's a challenging thing to do when people are bombarded at every turn with the culture of survivor, as we were talking about on the break, right? Where, like, all you have to do is compete and be better, and you can win, right? So we have lots of things up against us. but lots of good thinking, I think, to be done, particularly in the labor movement, because I think in our movement we're at very different places in very different organizations about these questions. And again, there is no opportunity. Like, I was hoping you actually were representing your employer. Just for a minute, I was cut open. Because we're at very different places in our movement about some of these things. So I'll stop with that.
Some really good comments. Just touching on a few about the working class being split around pensions. I think it's a real issue today because you see people pointing their finger at the GM worker who has a decent pension and saying, you know, that's why my car costs so much, which really has nothing to do with why their car costs so much. And then the other finger gets pointed at the public sector workers. Why should they have this pension? And I think why the CPP campaign is so important is because unions are seen to advance the issue of pensions for all workers, not just the unionized workers. On the issue of the fiduciary responsibility, you reminded me that actually, the CAW was able to convince the GM, Ford, and Chrysler, when we used to call them the Big Three, that to not invest in South Africa, the apartheid regime. That was the one stream that we did advance successfully. And the last comment I'll make is about the RRSPs and well, yes, I mean, that really was something for wealthy people who would get the advantage of the tax breaks. But to me, a really important issue that's come up today is these tax-free savings accounts. Because while the CLC had been advancing the issue of better old age security and guaranteed income supplement, improving the guaranteed income supplement to get people not just over the poverty line, but actually well over the poverty line, what Harper said was, no, we don't have to do anything to the guaranteed income supplement because we're going to let poor people save for their retirement, and the guaranteed income supplement is not going to affect their tax-free savings account, right? Or the tax-free savings account won't affect their guaranteed income supplement. Well, we know that people making minimum wage are not going to be putting their money into the tax-free savings account. We know who's going to be putting their money into the tax-free savings account. So I think it's, again, another issue we have today that is very complex.
Chris?
Yeah, let's say a couple of things. I'm just struck by, and I think others are as well, this contradiction that we have of, on the one hand, crying needs for investment in high-quality services, childcare. We need to develop our Canadian resources that right now we just kind of rip out of the ground and ship overseas. We got to rebuild our manufacturing. We have, you know, we have thousands and tens of thousands of people unemployed in this country, or underemployed. We have crying needs for investment in job creation, good jobs, and in production, in services and goods. But on the other hand, we've got, you know, corporations sitting on $500 and $600 billion of cash, having received enormous tax cuts that have gone, you know, into share buybacks and the like, really depressed business investment, investing in the wrong places, in destroying good jobs, destroying pensions, the like. You know, we've got clearly a contradiction here. So, you know, how can we steer investment or take control of investment to meet the needs that are so evident and that the market isn't addressing and providing for? And that's the whole question, I think, that we need to kind of wrestle with. We've got this crumbling infrastructure, we've got clean water needs on reserves, such huge, chronic, you know, long-standing needs that we have to address. Well, how can we organize investment differently that you know, at the same time as it pursues non-market or non-profit defined objectives, could also, you know, really be determined by people's needs as they define them, and that would bring them into the process of making those decisions. That's really, I think, what the whole question should be about. But that's an incredibly difficult question to raise, because it does mean confronting the accumulated power of financial capital, which sits in control of all of these decisions about where investment goes and which needs are met, etc. But until we kind of confront that monopoly of power and the priorities, determining those priorities, I think we're not really coming to grips with the underlying problem, and that we've really gone through this enormous financial crisis, which revealed how weak we are in being able to challenge the incredibly contradictory decisions that were made by those that control investment capital. And we've really been unable to challenge that effectively. The only other thing I wanted to say is that there's a lot of bad news stories and a lot of kind of dour discussion here, but there, it is important that, as has also been raised, that these enormous funds do respond to political opposition and challenges. And I was thinking of the CPP case with the privatization of the UK Royal Mail, the post office in the UK, that the coalition government in the UK looked like it was going to go ahead with privatizing this public service, and it looked like it was going to be one of the private equity deals that involved, Canadian pension funds, which have been leading proponents and leading participants in privatizations around the world, but not in Canada, which is interesting. But then, because of opposition in Britain, there were threatened strikes, etc., they decided to float an initial public offering, or float the shares, equity shares, that way. But I think it's interesting to reflect that although Canada is a very big market for P3s, actually the involvement of Canadian pension funds in those domestic P3s is much less than you might expect. In fact, Canadian pension funds are world leaders in P3 investments, but outside of Canada.
That's right.
And that's because it's politically much more controversial still in Canada than it is in countries like the UK or Australia, which have beaten back over years the opposition to privatizing rail systems and the rest. So it's not accidental, I don't think, that these pension funds have had to go outside of Canada. Now they're coming back. They're coming back with a vengeance. But there's still a fight, and they are still susceptible or sensitive to pressures that we're really good at mobilizing. So that's something to take confidence.
I'm thinking about this besides what Chris and others have been saying about the funding or expansion of the CPP and dealing with benefit structures which are therefore more universal, et cetera, less dependent upon the market and funding needs. I think to deal with those in opposition to neoliberalism right now, the concessions that are coming, or the disciplinary constraints on social audits, or attempting to use responsible investment into refunding, there is also the deeper problem within the social structures of capitalism right now, which make this very difficult. And I think we can't kind of leave that completely to the side. We have the longer term development within capitalism of the separation of ownership and control. That is, the legal owners in the paper economy is further and further separated from the direct possession of those assets. At the same time, we have an increasing dependence of all of us as workers on some mechanism to provide for incomes in retirement. And this has then fused in and around the financial structures vis-a-vis pensions. The real part that's accurate in all these books, which means it's an incredibly difficult knot to unwind when you have this deepening financialization, this deepening dependence upon funds coming through some sort of some sort of planned structure to fund all of us aged. And this has become a crucial knot in the structure of contemporary capitalism. And how we're going to unwind that without kind of serious political ruptures, even just to deal with the expansion of the planned of a universal benefit, is a crucial political constraint right now. And that is, immediately you see the problem. That's the limit. It always occurs around social audits. That's the constraint, because you're dependent upon this and you're having difficulty unwinding it. And it's becoming more, and things are becoming more and more intertwined. It's also the constraint on using investment funds to shift it responsibly to more productive investments, the particular thesis that Blackburn puts forward of how to do that. I just think we have to keep in mind this larger political structure and social structure that is involved. It really makes it difficult to unpack this. This is an incredibly knotted social structure right now. Anyways, that's the big constraint that's we can't kind of lose sight.
We're going to solve it in 5 weeks.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm just saying. That's partly why we've got to keep that constraint in mind and not just focus on the social audit question, or that as important as that. Most of us have been engaged in. I first became interested in pension funds exactly through the South African struggle a long time ago. Yeah, Kevin,
Back to 2 points made from the floor: the question about Blackburn, and also the question about ESG, environmental social governance. Excuse me, losing my voice. This allows me to share one other citation from Blackburn that I think is really important and will connect to the next session, which is dedicated to socially responsible investment and all of these debates. Because while I agree with what Chris said about Blackburn, all those positive, it's an interesting experiment, there is one element in his argument that I think I have a very serious disagreement with. And it's something I think we need to chew on. So that is this. Let me just stop and say, what do we hear from the retail ethical mutual funds that market themselves as you know, as ethical and socially responsible? What do we hear from them? A key message: you can make lots of money and be socially good at the same time, be ethical. There's no contradiction there, right? I think that's BS. I think people who believe that are not living in the real world. And unfortunately, I think Blackburn adopts a little bit of that, as do most of the socially responsible investment proponents. So let me just share this one citation from Blackburn's book that was in the reading. He says, "I believe in these circumstances it will be possible to persuade majorities that social injustice and ecological irresponsibility are not the best way to build healthy enterprises, nor to contribute to long-term fund value." Basically, I read that as saying, being unfair to your workers, being environmentally reckless, is not going to be profitable in the long term.
Depends on how you define the long term.
So then he says, therefore, so these social funds, these expanded social funds that Chris described, could therefore seek both to promote a responsible accumulation and to offer the generality of citizens a chance to participate in shaping the future of their communities. So it's democratized, but he's also making the argument that, you know, you can make a good rate of return and not have these contradictions. My own reaction to that is I just don't see that. Doesn't mean I'm not keen on the democratic element, but I think it's a dangerous argument to make for Blackburn, coming from the left in response to Tim. You know, he comes out of the UK left, whatever strand of it. It's one of the reasons I think he's interesting and important. One of the few socialists to really chew on some of these issues and spell out a whole lot of proposal, and I don't think we've had much of a debate about that. But I think that's a dangerous argument to make that we don't need to accept. And in fact, I think, connecting to the fiduciary and pension funds, I think one of the most capitalistic and dangerous principles that we're all taught and that the trustees get taught is that we have an obligation to maximize the rate of return when we invest. I think we need to break that idea and instead move to a socially determined planning of how investment should work, and not accept that it's some market-determined rate of return that we have to somehow match. So I think that's an important element of that argument, and I think it will be brought forward in the next session.
Here's what they want to kind of end on.
One of the things that some of the pension fund managers have said to me, so for example, many of our funds now own most of the United Kingdom, right? The water system, the airports, the train systems, the public, what used to be called public transit.
Yes, exactly.
Are owned by keeping members and others in pension plans. And so in talking to some of the leaders of the pension fund, not our members, but you know, the CEOs and stuff, they basically say like, well, I mean, wouldn't you prefer we owned it than like some other buddy on Bay Street? Like at least we understand that it's important. I mean, you guys do public sector. We're not gonna flip it for profit. Like we understand that it's a long-term investment. And like, wouldn't you prefer if somebody's gonna own it? Isn't it better that we own it? Like there's a question that we should. And we can go back to the point of saying, well, of course no one should own it. Of course it should be. But okay, so what's the path back to that then? Like so there's academic principle, not to be not to sound too flip, but there's also like so there are concrete things that we need to unpack and explain and make a plan about, rather than just sounding like, well, that's wrong and this is right, but they're so far apart. What's the difference there? And in the meantime, there's a shitload of money that's our members' money, right? So, like, what is the way to invest it in a socially responsible way that will provide for pensions, that isn't obsessed with maximizing profit, but that also could do good things? I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know that people are willing to come up with the answer, because either it's like we feel like it's so dirty that there is no good way to invest. So like, so then what do we do? Like, so, you know, I think it would be really interesting to have somebody start thinking about what would we advocate for if we could use these pools of resources differently. But none of that's happening. Like, it doesn't matter. We can come up with a lovely plan. We have no control over this money right now. Let's just be honest. We have no control over the Canada Pension Plan. We have no control over OMERS. We have no control over these plans. Like, workers don't actually have control over them. Like, they just don't, right? The OMERS structure is one where it is jointly trustee. That means it's 50-50. And God forbid one of the unions, and sometimes that happens, might vote with the employer. And then we're really screwed. Like, we can't do nothing, right? It's a complicated structure. So none of these things will happen without really figuring out worker control of workers' money that currently exists in plans.
Excellent.
Very quickly, we have opened up some really big topics that I think are probably going to be very relevant in the next sessions that come up. Just one of the things Herman was talking about, which reminded me, and there was another comment made earlier, about using public unions' pension funds to channel them towards certain investments. And I remember the NDP in Ontario, when they found the cupboard was absolutely bare when they came to government, came up with this idea that they would use the public sector pension funds. They would take 1%, or I can't remember what it was, maybe it was more than, was it 5? Okay, yes, 5%, and use that to fund these projects that would be good for communities and so on. There was an uproar from the public sector unions. Sam Ginden's position was, well, let's not just do it to the public sector unions. Every pension fund should have this 5% contribution, and then develop this notion of a national investment fund where communities could come up with strategies about how they wanted to use funds, what was their project. And you know, Sam's point was, let's put it back on workers to come up with the strategies for what they want to do in their communities and have a legitimate plan for how to do that. So it was a great idea, and we tried to find that paper that Andrew Jackson did on the National Investment Fund, and he was retired. He went to his basement and dug it out of the box. Yeah, I've got 2 copies.
The archivists of the union, yeah.
Chris? Thanks, Ron.
I think that's a great point. That in the Ontario example reminds us that financial markets periodically go into crisis, and in those crises there are opportunities to raise alternatives to the existing status quo. When investment seizes up, when there's a clear need to take the reins of these investments, then there's an opening for alternatives that kind of take us outside the narrow confines of the possible in the moment. And the challenge is to get those proposals together now and not wait for the crisis to raise these alternatives, but to have them ready so we can talk about them. I completely agree. A social movement, a mass movement, to challenge the control, private control over investment is absolutely critical. The banks, the financial institutions, that mass movement will have to include labor, but it will have to go beyond labor, and it will have to be a genuine social uprising challenging that control. But when there is popular control over social investment, that won't be the end of the solution. There will be real contests over how to use that money. You know, there will be people who want to invest in the cheapest thing, and others that want to, you know, invest in ways that have environmental benefits. Those politics are still going to be there, and that's where I see Blackburn's point about the need to then think about the kinds of principles and guiding determinants that you want to have as part of the discussion to have socially productive and genuinely useful investments, rewarding investments. That it's not so much that I think he's talking about the possibilities of romantically ethical investing. He's actually saying that even in an ideal world where we have control over these things, that's not the end of the story. You're going to need these hard discussions about what sorts of investments we want to undertake. There's going to be a lot of disagreement, and at that moment, you need to kind of begin to raise the question, well, what sort of investments and what principles do we want to engage in? And I would just also endorse the vote for, you know, working on this stuff now so that we can have them ready-made when people go looking for solutions. And we want them to look to the labor movement for real workable solutions.
Excellent. I'm going to, before we end, I want Kevin to kind of say something and then lead into the next session.
Sure. Thank you. And maybe first of all, let's thank the panel. I really appreciate their willingness to do that. If I could, to segue to the session in 2 weeks' time, I'd like to pick up on this bit that Joanne threw in at the end, which I really appreciate, this Ontario Investment Fund debate from the early 90s. It reminded me of one thing that none of us have said, but I'm very happy to have a chance now. We had, until 1998, I think one of the most socially responsible pension funds in the country that was dedicated to investing in infrastructure, social infrastructure, that was democratically determined and not seeking maximized rates of return. Does anybody know what that fund was? It was changed in 98, 99. It was the Canada Pension Plan Reserve Fund. When CPP was established in 1966, it was decided that while it's pay-as-you-go, there will be a fund worth 2 years of benefits, and it would be invested. And it would be automatically invested in loans to the provincial governments that would use it to build roads, schools, hospitals, universities, everything else. And it was done until 98. And I'll end with a provocative point on this, because I actually started working on pensions around this time when this happened. And the Paul Martin led initiative to save the CPP in that period, the late 90s. One of the key elements that they attached to a bunch of trimming and cuts and various things was to privatize the investment structure and end that pro-public sector investment structure. And the provocative thing I'll add, there I was at QP, still kind of new to it, what would you guess was the labor movement's collective response to that proposal?
CLC opposed it.
CLC opposed it, QP opposed it. I don't know about it. I didn't see any other briefs that took a position on it.
CAW opposed it.
Thank God. Let's keep adding to the list.
Yeah, anyway.
There's got to be someone else. I'm so young, I have no idea what happened back then. This is all history.
Anyway, but the point is, even though the CAW, the CLC, and the QP may have taken on paper a position, what did we do politically? Do people even remember this? This wasn't even really a political debate. It was kind of like we were getting steamrolled, and some people were just happy that they didn't get rid of the CPP. So anyway, I just mentioned that because to my mind, that's an example of a very interesting and socially responsible pension fund that we actually had. Anyway, so to connect this, in 2 weeks, the session, as I mentioned, is going to be dedicated to some of these difficult debates about what is socially responsible investment, is it possible, what are the contradictions.